democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Our guest is Adam Hochschild. His book is To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918. I wanted to read you from Memorial Day, LA Times last year. In the United States, beginning with the Korean War, disadvantaged communities have suffered a disproportionate share of the nation's wartime casualties, while richer communities have been more insulated from the costs of war. Furthermore, the data suggests this casualty gap between rich and poor communities has reached its widest proportions in the ongoing conflict in Iraq.
Yeah, that's something that's been very true for several decades in American wars. You look at the people who died in Vietnam and in Iraq and Afghanistan, very few sons or daughters of CEOs, of senators, of members of Congress, practically none. They're from poor communities, they're from small towns, they're often people who enlisted in the military because, you know, they had very few other economic opportunities. One of the haunting things to me about the First World War was, curiously, it was the exact opposite then. Usually, the ruling classes of most countries are pretty good at getting other people to do their dying for them. But in World War I, it was the other way around, because in most countries it was the usual thing for young men from the upper classes, from the aristocracy, to go into the army, to become officers, and it was those young officers who climbed out of the trenches first and led their men into this relentless hail of machine gun fire. And if you look at the statistics, it's amazing. Men who graduated from Oxford in 1913, for example, 31% were killed. Lord Salisbury, Prime Minister of England at the turn of the century, had 10 grandsons. 5 of them were killed in the war. One of them is a character in this book.
Talk about the pacifist campaigner and her brother commander of the Western Front.
This was another fascinatingly divided family that I found. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out how to tell the story of this conflict between the believers in the war and the opponents. And then one day I was reading a very boringly written scholarly article about a woman named Charlotte Despard, who was an ardent pacifist, wrote the leading anti-war pamphlet, traveled up and down Britain speaking against the war, had been to jail several times in the battle for women's suffrage, backed independence for Ireland and India, all the radical causes of the day. One sentence in passing, the writer said, of course these activities were deeply distressing to her brother. And it gave his name, which I recognized, Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front. And the fascinating thing, as soon as I saw that, I realized I have to write about this pair. What an extraordinary combination. The interesting thing is that this brother and sister were personally quite close to each other. She had helped bring him up. He was 8 years younger. She'd taught him the alphabet when he was a kid. They continued to see each other during the war. They stopped speaking to each other only when, in 1918, the British government appointed him Viceroy of Ireland in charge of suppressing the Irish nationalist revolt against British rule. She went to Ireland to work for the IRA. They stopped speaking at that point. But this was one of many, families that were divided by this conflict in this way.
Why did World War I happen?
That, I think, is one of the most striking things about it. It was really not a war that in any way was fought for any great principle. And up until a few weeks before it began, everybody was getting along rather well. There had been some tension in the air. There were rival alliances. There'd been a naval arms race between Britain and Germany. But June 1914, everybody was getting along well. There were no outstanding border disputes. No country claimed part of another's territory. There was a huge amount of cross-border trade, joint ventures in business, so forth. The British fleet paid a ceremonial visit to Germany, and when they turned around and sailed for home, the British commander sent a signal to his German counterpart, friends now and friends forever. And then there was this peculiar chain of events. And it began when, of course, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated at Sarajevo. And this started things going because this enormous, creaky Austro-Hungarian Empire had long been wanting to invade and dismember the much smaller state of Serbia next door. They had already drawn up invasion plans. The assassination of the Archduke, even though he was killed by an Austro-Hungarian citizen, and there's no evidence that Serbia's cabinet knew of this assassination plot, gave them the excuse. So they went ahead with their invasion. The Serbs turned to their friend Russia, you know, fellow Slavs, fellow Eastern Orthodox believers. Russia was allied with France. When Russia mobilized its troops, France began doing the same thing. This gave Germany the excuse to attack both France and Russia, things that they had long had plans to do. And in less than 6 weeks, the whole continent was aflame.
The movements that you describe, I wanted to go back to the other books you have written. For example, Bury the Chains, Prophets and Rebels in the Fight to Free an Empire Slaves, the anti-slavery movement, the anti-war movement, how it gets marginalized, how people get imprisoned, and yet how ultimately it triumphs. Put it in the context, the anti-war movement of World War I with the anti-slavery movement. Britain, maybe people don't realize, ended slavery decades before the United States.
They did, and it was in large part a result of two things. One is slave revolts in the West Indies, something that tends to get written out of the history books, and a remarkably feisty, wonderfully organized, popular anti-slavery movement in England, which really pioneered all kinds of techniques that community organizers still use today. You know, they made the first political poster, and you've probably seen it. It's that diagram of a slave ship with the slaves' bodies packed very tightly inside. Well, this was a movement that was successful. Slavery did finally come to an end in the British Empire and elsewhere in the world. The challenge for me in writing about the First World War was, could I write as interesting and as gripping a story about a movement that didn't prevail because the pacifists were not able to stop the war? I felt still it was an important story to tell, because if we only tell the stories of the movements that are victorious, we're going to be leaving a lot of things out of history. And sooner or later, I hope that people who want to stop all war will be victorious. And I think that they're going to have a better chance of doing so if they know some of the history of people who have been involved in that struggle before.
In a piece you wrote, Adam, Cold Echoes of a Bygone War, the eerie thing about studying World War I is the way you can't help but be reminded of today's headlines. Would you say the anti-war movement has failed today? I mean, we are involved in the longest continuous war in the history of this country, Afghanistan, led by a president who campaigned against war, the other war in Iraq, and yet we're still in Iraq as well.
We've certainly failed so far to stop both wars, and I feel very sad about that. And I feel, you know, as we were talking a moment ago, that if there were a way that American people could visually see that toll, like looking at some of these gigantic cemeteries, this is something that might bring it to a stop sooner. Something else that I think would bring the wars to a stop sooner is, although I don't see any practical likelihood of this happening, is if we went back to having a draft. I think that's one of the reasons why the Vietnam War came to an end, that in addition to the tremendously stiff resistance that the Vietnamese put up, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets here because those of us who were of draft age at that time knew we didn't want to go and fight in this war. When it was a question of putting our lives on the line for this war, that drew in people's families as well. But the way that you know, our country has worked out to wage wars now, it's first of all done by, you know, all volunteer military, and then by these things that sort of further seem to distance us from it, like, you know, drone attacks, you know, where there are no Americans at risk, and the only casualties are, you know, the people on the ground in these countries. So it's a tough job, but I still think, you know, we need to figure out how to bring these wars to a halt. Afghanistan, You can see there was a motive at the beginning. It was a reasonable enough one for the U.S. to get involved there. This was a government that was sheltering the people who planned the September 11th attacks. But by this point, I think even a lot of people high in the U.S. government understand that we are generating more jihadists by remaining engaged there.
We're going to continue in a post-show conversation. We'll post it online at democracynow.org. Adam Hochschild, our guest, to end all wars, has